Hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for Warrior Chat. We're so happy you're with us. We're going to give you some annual financial data, in fact our annual financial report for year-end 2012, June 30th, 2012. Lost track of my years here all of a sudden.
All run together.
Yeah, so thank you so much for being with us. I'm happy you are. I think you'll find the information that we provide very interesting, but also very important as we talk here about the Southern New York County School District. So with me for this discussion is our business manager, Mrs. Susan Green. So Susan, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
First of all, I want to let everyone know that Mrs. Green is just absolutely outstanding in everything you do, and I appreciate that very much.
Thank you.
What she does, first of all, she's just very detail-oriented, an outstanding accountant, but more than that, you're a wonderful leader, and you treat every dime that our school district has as it's important that we value it and we're good stewards for that money. So thank you as we open up this report. It's very important. First of all, I guess as we talk about the 2011-2012 year, I think it's important to talk about the results of that year from a financial standpoint. Do you want to give some of the highlights, please?
Yes, last year we actually finished the year very well, and that was planned. We finished with a surplus of about $871,000. We knew going into the fiscal year that it was going to be another tough one. So at the beginning of the fiscal year, around September, October, we went to all of the administrators and asked them to make sure only spend absolutely what you absolutely have to have for the classroom. So we wanted to drive that surplus to be able to balance the 12-13 budget. So it put us in a very good position for this fiscal year.
We'll talk a little bit about that moving forward in just a little bit, but again, strong financial performance as we ended the year in a surplus, and very critical in these uncertain economic times, as you said, to have money to move forward to use to balance future budgets is why that's very important. What happens to that money? We talk about the general fund, unreserved fund balance. Can you explain that with us, and again, what happens to that surplus and what it means?
What happens to the surplus is similar to your home budget. If you bring in more money than what you actually spend, it rolls into our savings account or our fund balance. And what we use that for is for cash flow. It's important to have cash flow in a business, and also it's important to have money back for unforeseen circumstances. So our board policy is a minimum of 5% fund balance at the end of the year. You know, we budget that way, and what we had is about 6.9%, so we're a little higher. So that's actually very healthy, and it's very important to have fund balance so that when you go out for bond ratings or other financial transactions, it shows a healthy organization.
The state also caps that fund balance at 8%, so I think we kind of have a good place to be in there. And the concept of the state capping that is so school districts just don't tax their public to build up a savings account, so to speak. But nonetheless, it is important to have what we have, a board policy of 5%. So it's not a lot of margin of error in there.
Right. It's a balancing game. Again, you don't want to tax any higher than you need to, but you need to have resources for unforeseen circumstances. So I think we do a good job of balancing that in between. Absolutely.
The other point that we make here, which I think is a very, very important one, is our physical plant is in outstanding condition. And I mention that because in the next 10 years, we don't envision any huge expenditures in terms of needing to add space or needing to do major renovations, because we just now, with the Friendship Elementary School project, completed renovation of all of our existing facilities, which began with Shrewsbury Elementary School about 14 years ago. So our physical plant's in good condition, and you know, I always credit the board because they have a history of dedicating approximately 1% of our budget to an ongoing capital program, and that has prevented huge spikes in expenditures in order to get our facilities caught up and get them up to par as they need to be. So I think that has shown a lot of foresight long term.
Right, similar to your house, if you keep up with things, you know, you budget it each year versus having these huge expenditures.
And this one you should be very proud about. Our financial audits for the last 4 years having unqualified opinions and no findings. That's rare because the auditor's job is to find things, and so you should feel very good about that. You're responsible for that.
I do, and actually I want to throw a plug out for the business office staff, especially Tercy Krebs, in helping with that, making sure that you know, we're following control procedures and doing the right things at all times.
And again, not necessarily to harp on it, but I think also it shows we believe in openness, we believe in following proper procedures for all of our financial reporting, and again, I think that's our responsibility, to be good stewards of the public's money, and that is reflective of the entire business office.
Right.
So thank you, wonderful job. This slide probably you need to sit on for a minute or two, because it's just a lot of data. But the importance of it is it does show the tax rates of the York County school districts that are located in the Lincoln Intermediate unit. Just wanted to point a few things out there, please.
If you look towards the bottom, it's from highest to lowest tax rate. So we have both the next to lowest real estate tax rate for York County school districts in the LIU, and also equalized mills. So, you know, it's not our goal to be the lowest or our goal to be down there, but basically what we try to do is make sure that we're only taxing to the level that we need in order to have a outstanding educational program.
Yeah.
So
no, you're right. And we talk a lot about, no, I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things that we're currently showing on Warrior TV also is the educational report for the year that shows that we're in the top tier of school districts in York County in terms of providing outstanding educational program. So the reason, you're right, our goal, that's our mission, that's our goal. Primary goal is to provide that outstanding educational program for all of our children here in the Southern York County School District. And I know our public supports that tremendously, and we thank you so much for that. But the important thing is we're able to do that through hard work, efficiency, making sure that the dollars are spent wisely and dedicated to the classroom. That's the important thing.
definitely, and again, you know, our goal is to always have the lowest possible tax increase that we can in order to facilitate that.
Oh, you make a good point, because the last 3-4 years we've been lower than the index provided by the Board of Education, or provided to the Board of Education from the Department of Education, and that is significant, because the mindset of many boards has been the tax to that index all the way up to the top of that index, just because there are uncertain times.
Right, and actually in the last couple of years with the Friendship Project, we actually could have gone above the index. We had exceptions we could have taken. But again, we do that balancing act between what's right for the taxpayers and what's right for the students.
Yeah. Then in this right-hand column, which gives data for equalized mills for 2010 and 11, and the reason that's backdated is because that's the most recent data that's available through the Pennsylvania Department of Education. And the reason that number is important is that takes all of our local taxes that's collected divided by our market value. So that truly is an effort to compare tax rates from border to border across school districts.
Right, it also takes into account your assessments and your earned income taxes.
Right. So that's an important number also. And even there we are, again, next to the lowest. That's not necessarily our goal. Our goal is to provide the best education, but primarily to do it in a way that's cost effective, cost efficient, and to manage every dollar effectively.
Right, and it's also a meter for us to show that, okay, you know, we must be doing things well because we are down there towards the bottom. So it's something for us to look at to make sure we're
Absolutely.
checking our numbers.
This next slide, we talk a lot about return on investment, and these are what we consider, the top tiers in terms of providing educational programs locally here. Of course, Dallastown, York Suburban, and us. This is not the end all, because there's lots of different variables, obviously, but it does give you an idea that our median home in Southern York County School District has a value of $176,000, and it gives you an idea of what tax bills would be at Dallastown and York Suburban.
Right, and basically what the $176,000 represents is the assessed value, not necessarily the market value, and we get that number each year, so that's the median, that's the middle number. So at Dallastown you'd be paying about $3,900 versus your $3,000 in Southern York.
It's interesting though. Again, not the end all, but it is interesting data to look at and take a second to view. And again, for example, if you took our median assessed value of $176,000, plop that house in Dallastown School District, for example, you would pay about $900 more on your real estate tax. And I guess in business terms, we call that return on investment. We believe we're providing that outstanding educational value for a relatively low cost.
Right.
I do want to talk a little bit about the Friendship Elementary School project. It's a project we're recently wrapping up after about 1.5 years of work at Friendship Elementary School. It's almost a $17 million project. But I think what's important is most of that money, about $9 million, was spent just for infrastructure only. So, for example, it had the original 1958 roof on it, updated the plumbing, electrical systems, and also updated that building to make it code compliant. For example, added sprinkler systems and so forth to that building. It was significant that we had the ability to add that infrastructure work into this major project because it does bring back state reimbursement.
Right. If you have what's called a Plan-Con approved project through the state, you get reimbursement. So we get between 25 and 30% of the money back on our bond issue from the state because it's an approved project. So it makes sense to plan your major projects like that and upgrades during a Plan-Con project.
Absolutely. And the opposite example would have been, say we replaced that roof for approximately $1 million 5 years ago. Prior to this project, that would have, and all that money would have entirely been from local funding,
right,
as opposed from state funding. Just to give you a sense of what was done at that building, in addition to the infrastructure, we did add additional classroom space to meet actually current enrollment. We have over 500 children in that building right now for a building that was built for just a little over 400, so we needed the space now, and also then we added space that will allow us to meet the needs of our elementary enrollment projections for the next 10 years. And I mention that because that's important because, again, for the next 10 years we don't envision having to add space here in the Southern York County School District unless something happens that we don't envision.
Right.
Real high growth, but I think we're situated pretty well in all of our buildings to handle any growth that we anticipate. The other thing that's significant about that project is we're able to finance it with historic low financing.
Yeah, we were able to actually hit the market at a great point in December of 2010, at the end of December, and it was historically low. So we were able to borrow very low, and even though investment rates are very low too,
right,
we were able to borrow very low. So we got the money for very inexpensively.
Yeah, boy, that seems like about 20 years ago, doesn't it?
It does.
December 2010. The other thing I want to point out is it is a LEED certified building, which meets all the environmental certifications that are required, so we're very, very proud of that, as well as the building is extremely energy efficient. It's heated by a ground source pump system. In fact, we anticipate approximately 50 cents less per square foot for utilities now that the building is completed than prior to construction to the building, so it really is an energy efficient, state-of-the-art building. And then finally, we're proud to say that that project was on time and under budget. In fact, at this point, we're about $600,000 plus under our original estimate, and primarily due because, gosh, we're finishing that project with a very low level of change orders.
It's amazing to me,
yeah,
how few change orders we have. I've never dealt with a project with such low change orders, so it's very impressive.
And that's a credit to the design team. EI Associates was our architect out of Harrisburg. Barton Associates from York was our engineering firm, as well as project management. Randy Buffington, who's our director of operations. So I think that entire team needs to be very, very proud of that, and our community should be proud of just a beautiful building. We look forward to you seeing it and spending time in that building. Let's talk a little bit about public school funding overall. You know, let's crawl up on the roof and look down at public school funding. And this pie chart gives you an idea of where our revenue comes from for the Southern York County School District.
Right, I think it's a very telling chart. You know, basically most of our funding comes from local revenue, so it comes right from our community. Only about 31% comes from the state, and not even a percentage comes from the federal government. So, you know, basically our local community are the people that fund. So when you look at your tax bill, I mean, that's really where our money is coming from, predominantly.
You're right, and there's been a shift, and you know, you look at this first point that we're making here is since the mid-1970s, the shift for funding, is funding a word? The shift for funding public education has changed from the state contribution of 55% down to 36%. We're at 31.5%. So there's been a clear shift over the years from the state funding public education to it being a responsibility at the local level.
Yeah, yes, and additionally, not only has the shift happened, there's also been pretty much a moratorium on changing the formula. The formula hasn't changed since 1991. So not only is it an issue of they're not funding as much, they're also not funding it equitably across the state. So I mean, both of those issues create a problem for local communities.
Yeah, and that shift, and I don't want to sound like we're crying, or making excuses, but that shift has been one of the primary reasons that local taxpayers have seen an increase in bills, because it has been a shift from the state responsibility to the local level. And in fact, Pennsylvania ranks 44th out of 50 states in the state funding of public schools, according to the National Center of Educational Statistics.
Yeah, and I think it is important for people to understand when their tax bill comes that that is basically the only place that we get money, additional funding from. And I think, you know, a lot of people out there think that it's like a 50-50, or that districts are funded the same across the state. And I think it's important for people to understand that's not the case.
Absolutely. I think this is probably a little bit confusing to look at this graph, but let's try to walk everybody through it. There was a costing out study that was done by the Pennsylvania Board of Education in 2007. And that was pretty revealing, because what the Board of Education tried to do in this study was to analyze what the appropriate funding should be for Pennsylvania public schools based on educational standards that have been set. So, for example, what should it cost to educate a child in Pennsylvania in order for every child to meet the educational standards that we have set? And that's what this graph tries to depict.
Right. What it was trying to do, again, to summarize, is to say how much does it cost for schools to successfully educate students. And so what it shows is that there is a gap between how much is actually being spent, both at the state and the local level, and what it takes to actually have a student be successful. So your red piece of the gap is actually, red piece of the chart is actually your spending gap on how much more should be spent in order for a child to be successful.
Yeah. So, for example, if you look at this graph, in 2005-2006, at a local level, we spent $8,542, and the state, according to this costing out study, again, we should have spent an additional $2,356 in order to reach those proficient levels established. And then in 2010-11, our spending level was $8,219, so the gap grew over the years, and it's really grown because the state funding has obviously not grown, and costs have risen.
Right, and you know, some people at home might think, just based on the way we're explaining this number is the same throughout the state, whether you're in an urban area, suburban, but actually these numbers are based upon the area that you live in the state, and whether you're suburbia or an urban district. So it is based upon our school district, what it would cost in our school district, not statewide.
Nope, it's a good point. And I think the other, again, we talk about return on investment. I think, again, not that one piece of data tells the whole story, but again, it supports our return on investment that in a cost-effective way, we are providing an outstanding education for our children. You already mentioned this. We're working with an extremely outdated funding formula from the early 1990s. And for some reason, we just can't get it straightened out. And when I talk about we, the state government in terms of legislation, and it has created, I think we're trying to point this out just to get people an understanding of what the problem really is from a funding formula standpoint. What has created disparity, certainly not parity, throughout the state.
Right, and what we did was there's a lot of data out there on the Pennsylvania Department of Ed website. So what we did was we took the data to take the state funding and divide it by the number of students, what's called average daily membership in our world, but basically the number of students attending the school. And so we divided the state funding by the number of students and came up with the lowest funded district is Shanksville Stony Creek School District at $883 per student, which really is only a couple dollars per day. To Wallenpaupack Area School District, that's getting over $59,000, almost $60,000 per student per day. We fall a little better than that, than Shanksville, but way below Wallenpaupack at about around $4,000 per student.
Yeah, while the state average was almost 5,000.
Right, so we're well below the average. There's, well over half of the districts getting more funding than we are. So out of 500, we're about 337th lowest funded. And so, basically we're just not getting the same amount of money. And those are the kinds of things that we look at when we look at, okay, how are we doing? If we were, maybe 250 out of 500, we could lower our real estate tax bills.
Absolutely. No, and what our legislators tell us, and it makes sense that the legislators up in Walden-Paulpack area certainly are not going to vote to change the funding formula because, shoot, they're getting $60,000 a child.
Right.
So it's difficult to get to vote statewide. But again, it's a early 1990 funding formula that currently does not provide equity from school district to school district throughout the state.
And the one thing, real quickly, that we didn't explain was it's due to the enrollment shift throughout the state. Our area, in the Philadelphia area, those areas have been growing in students versus the Pittsburgh areas and those areas out west have half or a quarter of the students that they had in 1991. So really, it's a shift in enrollment without shifting the numbers.
Yep, good point. Also, special education, as costs continue to increase, primarily due to mandates for special education, which we are not against. Certainly our mission is to educate every child that walks through our doors. We want to do it, and we're committed to doing it well. But the special education funding has not followed that commitment.
Definitely not. In the last 6 years, it hasn't increased, and actually the governor's proposal for 2013-14 is a slight 0.5% decrease. We are trending about 10 to 12% increases each year for specialized services. So, it definitely is a huge problem. Yeah,
this information comes from the Pennsylvania Educational Law Center, but that the shift, again, from the state funding of special education to local funding now exceeds $2 billion a year. And again, a major driver in property taxes rising at the local level for school districts in the state, again, is the state commitment for funding special education has been flat and flat. Mandates and costs have risen. A $2 billion gap statewide is a lot of money.
Right, and I know our people at home have heard us say this before. We take every child with open arms,
Absolutely.
But they don't all cost the same, and we have to make sure that when we budget, that we allow for those special needs.
Absolutely, and we're committed to providing that education. Cyber charter school funding is also another thing that has, in the last couple of years, cost more and more money. Primarily in the urban areas in Pennsylvania, but it has spread out for all school districts, as now we are 100% at a local level responsible for funding cyber charter school students, the tuition costs that come down. And this one I find is interesting, that last year the Pennsylvania Auditor General reported that fixing the ways charter and cyber charter schools are funded in Pennsylvania would save taxpayers $365 million, yet we can't seem to get it done.
It's definitely an issue, and when you take one child out of one classroom in second grade, we don't lose $10,000 of expense, and that's basically what we have to pay the charter school. And again, not saying, like special ed, not saying we're anti-charter school in any way, but the funding formula is not correct. For that. Also, the accountability is not there for the charter schools, for attendance, for AYP, as you see in the next bullet in the slide. Adequate yearly progress for those students. Only 28% of the charter schools made it, and no cyber charter schools actually made adequate yearly progress. And most of the students that we have leaving our district are going to the cyber charter schools. So, they're not performing well. They're not living up to the expectations.
Yeah, I think it is important to point here that we might be the lowest, if not one of the lowest, in terms of the number of children attending cyber charter schools and charter schools that are left our school district. But nonetheless, it's about a $500,000 cost for us on an annual basis.
And rising, so it is a big concern.
And particularly the urban school districts. I mean, you're talking millions and millions that are taken from their budgets and their ability to provide their children appropriate funding levels for their educational process.
Another thing to point out is the charter school bill came about in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And at the beginning of the process, and until about 3 years ago, the state funded about 1/3 of the cost of charter schools.
Right.
So we were reimbursed 1/3 of our costs through state funding, and that was eliminated, I think, 3 years ago now. So we get none of the funding back. So again, that's another state mandate where it started to be partial funding, and now we get no funding for it.
Yeah. And I'll get up my soapbox just for a minute. And you know what? The purpose of this is the concept that competition will create better public schools. And anybody that knows me knows I'm going to compete. I'm a competitor, and I want to compete. But you got to make it a level playing field, and it's just not a level playing field.
Right.
And that's what it is. I mean, one example was a double dip pension reimbursement for cyber charter schools, where we pay the pension cost. Our payment to them is based on our pension cost, and then the state reimburses them for pension costs again.
Right.
So in effect, they get double payment for it. It's not a level playing field.
No.
Was that for my soapbox?
That's okay. But the other thing is, when we say we take everyone, that is not the case with the charter schools and the cyber charter schools. I mean, they don't have to take every student. They have an enrollment. They can refuse students. So again, for them to get the same level of funding when they may not have a high need student that costs a lot of money, I think is inequitable.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. We spent just a few minutes here talking about state funding of public education, not just there in Southern York County School District, but statewide. And just because I think it's important that our public has this information and is aware of really where their hard-earned tax dollars end up. And I think it's important that you have that information. Gosh, the last few years, with revenues reducing because of the economy at a lot of different ways, the state commitment to public education in a variety of ways. You mentioned the cutting of all reimbursement for charter school payments and so forth, but in a variety of ways has been reduced. But our ability to raise funds locally through interest earnings, through real estate transfer, earned income and so forth, which has not grown obviously until recently, has really forced us to do some major cuts in our program. Our commitment has been again to maintain our outstanding educational program. We've had to make cuts. Here's a list of some of them. I guess the thing I make out is as we prepare our budget for 2013-2014, it's getting more and more difficult to make that work.
It is getting very difficult, and just to provide an example of what you were talking about, interest earnings, we were at about $600,000 at the high per year, and now we're about, if we hit 50,000, I'm happy with that.
Yeah.
So we have seen not only increased expenditures that we talked about, but we've seen a huge decrease in our revenues. We're starting to bounce back, but we still are probably pre-2006, 2007 revenues in some areas, local areas.
Yep, absolutely. And again, here's our concern is that gap between the funding provided from the state and the funds needed to meet performance continues to grow. But again, our commitment to you is to provide open financial reporting to you. One of the reasons we want to provide this information to you today, but also our overall mission and commitment is to provide the best educational program for the children of Southern York County School District. And our community has a long-standing commitment to provide that public education, and we thank you so very much. Our children are our prized possessions, and I promise you that every dollar that you provide to us through your hard-earned through your hard work, we're going to take care of it, and that's my commitment to you, and I know Mrs. Green is out of the same mold, and thank you so much for all you do.
Thank you.
Okay, so for Trey, who's in our studio here doing all the right things, and for Mr. Tim Hare, the video production teacher at Susquehanna High School, and his students, as well as Mark Rill, our coordinator of marketing and public information, for Susan Green, our business manager, I'm Wayne McCullough saying, I'll see you next time.